The Saharan sun hung merciless in the cloudless sky, its heat distorting the air into shimmering waves that danced across the endless dunes. In this vast emptiness, three figures moved like shadows against the golden landscape. Two masked militants flanking a man whose red beret stood out like a beacon of defiance against the monotone desert. Ibrahim Traoré walked between his captors with the measured gait of a man who understood power far beyond the rifles pointed at his back. His hands were bound with military-grade zip ties, but his shoulders remained straight, his chin lifted toward the horizon as if he were surveying his own domain rather than being led to captivity. The militants, one Serbian, scarred by wars across 3 continents, the other Belgian, young enough to still believe in the romance of mercenary work, had expected screaming, pleading, the desperate bargaining of a man facing his mortality. Instead, they got silence, a silence so profound it made them question whether they had captured a prisoner or walked into a trap of their own making. "Target secured," the Serbian whispered into his radio, the static crackling back at him like electronic laughter. No response came. The communication blackout that would define the next 48 hours had already begun, though none of them knew it yet. The Belgian glanced nervously at the horizon, where heat mirages created the illusion of water that would never quench any thirst. "Something's wrong," he muttered, more to himself than his partner. "This is too easy." But Traoré heard him. The president of Burkina Faso, though his captors believed him to be merely another regional insurgent, turned his head slightly, just enough to catch the young soldier's eye. In that brief moment of contact, something passed between them. Not fear, not hatred, but a kind of recognition that would haunt the Belgian for months to come. "Easy is relative," Traoré said quietly, his first word since the abduction began. His voice carried the weight of a man who had stared down French colonial powers, negotiated with Russian oligarchs, and built trade networks across a continent that others had written off as hopeless. "The question isn't whether something is easy, it's whether it's right." The Serbian jabbed him with the rifle barrel. "Shut up." Traoré smiled, not with mockery, but with a patience that seemed infinite. "I wasn't talking to you." The rendezvous point was an abandoned fuel station, its rusted pumps standing like skeletal sentinels over cracked concrete. Here the operation's true scope began to unravel like a poorly woven tapestry. Markus Volkov waited beside a dust-covered Land Cruiser, clipboard in hand, his white cap stained with sweat and anxiety. When he looked up to see the approaching trio, his face went through a series of expressions: satisfaction, confusion, then dawning horror. "Why is he still wearing the beret?" Volkov's voice cracked like a teenager's. The Serbian shrugged. "Orders were to bring him alive, nothing about dress code." Volkov's hands trembled as he consulted his tablet, cross-referencing photos and intelligence reports that suddenly made terrible sense. The patch on Traoré's sleeve, a silhouette of the African continent breaking free from chains, seemed to pulse with significance under the harsh sunlight. "Jesus Christ," Volkov whispered, stepping backward, as if distance could somehow undo what had been done. "Do you know who this is?" The Belgian's grip tightened on his weapon. "Some rebel leader, high-value target. What's the problem?" "The problem," Volkov said, his voice rising to near hysteria, "is that you've kidnapped the president of Burkina Faso, the most protected man in West Africa, the one who kicked the French out and has half the continent ready to go to war for him." The words hung in the superheated air like a death sentence. The Serbian's eyes widened behind his tactical mask. The Belgian took an involuntary step backward, suddenly seeing their prisoner not as a target, but the epicenter of an international incident that could topple governments.
TRAORÉ watched their realization with the detached interest of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. "I tried to tell you this was too easy," he said conversationally, "but you weren't listening." In the distance, the horizon began to shimmer with movement. Not heat mirages this time, but something far more ominous. Dozens of small objects danced at the edge of vision, too low for satellites, too steady for birds. Drones. They appeared as if summoned by TRAORÉ's capture, their cameras trained on the abandoned fuel station like 1,000 electronic eyes recording history in real time. The first photograph appeared on social media at 3:47 p.m. local time. A grainy satellite image of a man in a red beret surrounded by armed figures. The caption was simple: "They took our lion." Within minutes, the image had spread across encrypted African networks faster than any virus. From Lagos to Nairobi, from Cairo to Cape Town, phones buzzed with notifications as the picture ricocheted through digital channels that intelligence agencies didn't even know existed.
In a cramped internet cafe in Ouagadougou, 16-year-old Aminata Kone stared at her cracked phone screen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She recognized that silhouette immediately. The same figure who had visited her school just months before, who had listened to her questions about water purification systems with the patience of a grandfather and the intensity of a scientist. Without hesitation, she typed 2 words that would echo across continents. "He lives." The message exploded through digital networks like digital wildfire. Hashtag "He lives" began trending in 37 languages within the hour. But this wasn't ordinary social media activism. It was the awakening of something that had been building for years, a Pan-African consciousness that transcended borders, languages, and colonial divisions. In Dakar, university students projected the image onto the side of the old French embassy. In Accra, market vendors closed their stalls and gathered around radio sets broadcasting emergency updates. In Kigali, government ministers received urgent calls from Moscow, Beijing, and Washington, everyone suddenly very interested in the fate of a man they had dismissed as a regional nuisance just days before. Back in the desert, the mercenary situation deteriorated with each passing hour. Communication systems failed one by one, not from technical malfunction, but from deliberate interference by technologies they didn't understand. The African Pantech Coalition satellite, launched in secret just months before, had repositioned itself directly overhead. Its signal overrode every frequency they tried to access, replacing their desperate calls for extraction with a live feed that was being broadcast to the world. Captain Niels Brooker paced the perimeter of their makeshift camp like a caged animal. His 20-year military career had prepared him for firefights, ambushes, and political complications, but not for becoming the unwitting star of an international drama broadcast in real time to 1 billion viewers. "Sir," his communications specialist called out, voice tight with panic. "We're picking up multiple signals, not just satellites, ground-based transmitters, mobile networks, even ham radio operators. It's like the entire continent is watching us." Brooker grabbed the headset and listened to the chatter flooding their receivers. Dozens of languages, hundreds of voices, all coordinating something vast and incomprehensible. Farmers reporting on their movement patterns, students translating news reports, military officers from a dozen nations suddenly very interested in the weather patterns over northern Burkina Faso. "What the hell have we walked into?" he muttered.
From his position in the crude holding cell, little more than a chain-link cage they'd assembled from equipment salvages, TRAORÉ watched the growing panic with the serene expression of a chess master, watching opponents realize they've been in checkmate for the last 10 moves. "You walked into history," he said quietly. "The question now is which side of it you want to be on." Marco Delvaux had seen enough wars to recognize the moment when everything changed. He'd been in Belgrade when the walls came down, in Kandahar when the Taliban melted away, in Damascus when the old order crumbled overnight. This felt the same, that electric tension that preceded seismic shifts in power. The Belgian mercenary, whose name tag read Janssen, hadn't eaten in 12 hours. His hands shook as he cleaned his rifle for the 4th time that day, the repetitive motion the only thing keeping his nerves from snapping entirely. "We should have left him where we found him," Janssen whispered to Delvaux during a guard change. "This isn't what we signed up for." Delvaux studied the young soldier's face, seeing his own doubts reflected there. 24 hours ago, they were professionals executing a routine extraction. Now they were kidnappers holding one of Africa's most beloved leaders while the entire world watched. "You're right," Delvaux said simply. "This isn't what we signed up for." The admission hung between them like a confession. Around the camp, other mercenaries were having similar conversations in hushed tones. The facade of professional competence was cracking, revealing men who had signed contracts without asking the right questions, who had followed orders without understanding their implications. At sunset, when the desert air finally began to cool, Delvaux made his choice. He approached TRAORÉ's cage not as a guard, but as a man seeking absolution. "I need to know something," Delvaux said, kneeling beside the chain-link barrier. "Did you let us take you?" TRAORÉ looked up from where he sat cross-legged on the sand, his beret casting a small shadow over his eyes. "What do you think?" "I think a man with half the world's intelligence agencies watching his back doesn't get captured by accident." TRAORÉ nodded slowly. "Then you are starting to understand." "Understand what?" "That sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do is show his people what happens when injustice thinks it's won." In a secure bunker beneath Brussels, emergency sessions were convening with the urgency of a nuclear crisis. Intelligence directors from 6 nations sat around a polished table, their faces illuminated by screens showing real-time satellite feeds of the desert camp. General Laurent Savon, France's military intelligence chief, rubbed his temples as he stared at the nightmare unfolding on his watch. "How did we not know?" he asked for the 3rd time in an hour. "Because we stopped listening," replied Dr. Catherine Morel, the Foreign Ministry's Africa specialist. "We've spent so many years treating this continent as a chessboard that we forgot the pieces could think for themselves." The screens around the room told the story of an intelligence failure so comprehensive it bordered on the absurd. Facial recognition software that had identified TRAORÉ within hours of his capture, social media analytics showing the geometric progression of #he lines across platforms, intercepts of phone calls between African capitals coordinating responses to the crisis. "The Russians are mobilizing," reported Colonel James Mitchell, representing NATO intelligence. "Not military units, diplomatic ones. They're positioning themselves as the reasonable alternative to Western chaos." "And Beijing?" Savon asked. "Silent, but their trade delegations across Africa are suddenly very busy." On the main screen, drone footage showed TRAORÉ sitting calmly in his cage while his captors grew increasingly agitated around him. The image was being broadcast live on news networks from Al Jazeera to BBC to CNN, each one struggling to explain how a routine mercenary operation had become the most watched international crisis in years. "Recommendations?" Savan asked. The room fell silent. How do you clean up a mess when the whole world is watching you make it? Dawn broke over the desert camp like a judgment. The mercenaries who had slept at all woke to find their world fundamentally changed. Overnight, their communication blackout had become total. Their GPS systems showed them in the middle of the ocean. Their satellite phones received only static, punctuated by distant voices speaking languages they didn't recognize. But most unsettling of all was the silence from their prisoner. TRAORÉ sat in meditation, his breathing so steady it seemed mechanical. His eyes were closed, but there was an alertness to his posture that suggested he was listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. The Serbian mercenary, his name was Dimitri Kostic, though he'd used a dozen aliases over the years, approached the cage with a mixture of curiosity and dread. "What are you waiting for?" he asked. "Truth." "What truth?" "The one you're about to discover." At that moment, as if summoned by his words, figures began emerging from the dunes. Not soldiers, that would have been simpler to understand. These were civilians, farmers with weathered hands and patient eyes, teachers carrying books instead of weapons, children who should have been in school but had somehow crossed hundreds of miles of desert to be here. They came not in formation but in small groups, families and friends walking together with the casual determination of people attending a community gathering. Some carried food and water, others brought nothing but their presence. The mercenaries raised their weapons, but the approaching civilians showed no fear. They simply kept walking until they formed a loose circle around the camp, sitting in the sand as if settling in for a long wait. An elderly woman with intricate scarification on her cheeks stood and addressed the cage directly, speaking in Moor, the local language. "She says she's come to bear witness," TRAORÉ translated for his captors. "Witness to what?" Dimitri demanded. "To what happens when power meets truth." By noon, hundreds of civilians surrounded the camp. They sat in the sand, patient as stones, occasionally sharing water or quiet conversation, but never taking their eyes off the chain-link cage where their president waited. The psychological effect on the mercenaries was devastating. They had signed up to fight soldiers, not to hold a beloved leader hostage while his people watched. Every weapon they carried felt heavier. Every order from their increasingly frantic commanders seemed more hollow. Captain Brooker tried one last time to re-establish contact with his handlers, his voice cracking as he shouted into dead radio equipment. "Phoenix Base, this is Desert Eagle. We need immediate extraction. The situation is compromised." Only static answered him. Marco Delvo had spent the morning watching the faces of the people surrounding them. He saw farmers who had walked for days to be here, mothers who had left their children with relatives to make this journey, old men who remembered when foreigners with guns meant only suffering.
"Brooker," he said quietly, "this has to end." "We follow orders," Brooker snapped back. "That's what professionals do." "Professionals also know when a mission has gone to hell." Delvo unholstered his sidearm, not to threaten, but to make a point. "Look around. We're not holding a prisoner. We're surrounded by a nation." The confrontation that followed was brief but decisive. When Delvo walked to the cage and began cutting TRAORÉ's restraints, only 2 of the remaining mercenaries moved to stop him. The rest stood paralyzed, caught between training and conscience. TRAORÉ stepped out of the cage not as a freed prisoner, but as a man who had never truly been captive. He nodded to Delvo with the respect one professional shows another, then turned to address the hundreds of people who had come to bring him home. He spoke in Mooré,
his words carrying across the desert air like music. Then he switched to French, then English, ensuring everyone could understand. "Today," he said, "you have seen that cages are built by fear, and fear dissolves when truth walks free." The journey back to Ouagadougou became a procession that grew with every mile. What started as a few hundred supporters became thousands as word spread through the villages and towns along the route. Farmers left their fields, merchants closed their shops, students abandoned their classes, all to line the roads and witness their president's return. International news crews, scrambling to catch up with a story that had evolved faster than their editorial schedules, captured footage that would dominate global media for weeks. Here was a leader walking freely among his people, protected not by armed guards, but by the simple fact that he belonged among them. In the presidential vehicle, which he had declined to enter, preferring to walk alongside the crowd, advisors frantically worked their phones, trying to manage the diplomatic fallout from what could have been an international incident. But TRAORÉ seemed unconcerned with diplomatic protocols. He stopped to drink water offered by a village elder, paused to listen to a child's question about the solar panels on his new school, took time to examine a young engineer's prototype for a more efficient grain mill. These moments, captured by dozens of cameras and phones, told a story that no press conference could convey. A leader whose power came not from fear, but from connection, not from weapons, but from trust. Instead of heading directly to the presidential palace for the expected press conference, TRAORÉ's convoy made an unexpected detour to the technical university on the outskirts of Ouagadougou. The motorcade slowed to a stop in front of a modest laboratory building, its blue door marked with a simple sign, "Innovation for All." Inside, 24 young engineers and students worked on projects that would have seemed mundane to outside observers, but represented revolution to those who understood. A water purification system powered by solar energy and locally made charcoal filters, drought-resistant crop varieties developed through traditional breeding methods, a mobile phone app that connected rural farmers directly to urban markets. When TRAORÉ entered, alone, having left his security detail outside, the students looked up in stunned silence. Here was their president, still wearing the clothes he'd worn in captivity, still carrying the dust of the desert on his boots. A young woman named Fatima approached nervously, carrying a clear plastic bottle filled with the cleanest water she had ever produced using their filtration system. She had worked on this project for months, dreaming of the day when every village would have access to clean water without depending on foreign aid or expensive imported technology. TRAORÉ accepted the bottle, examined it with the attention of a scientist rather than a politician, then drank deeply. The room held its collective breath as he considered the taste, testing it against the standards of a man who understood that technology's true measure is not its sophistication, but its impact. "Real power," he said finally, his voice carrying to every corner of the laboratory, "is what builds, not what breaks." Those words, captured on dozens of phone cameras and uploaded to social media within minutes, would become the defining soundbite of his presidency. But in that moment, they carried a more immediate message, that a leader's true strength is measured not by his ability to destroy his enemies, but by his commitment to creating something better. 3,000 miles away, in a quiet suburb of Brussels, retired General Pierre Langella sat at his mahogany desk, wrestling with words that seemed inadequate to the moment. The television in his study played footage of TRAORÉ's return on repeat, the desert procession, the laboratory visit, the crowd celebrating in the streets of Ouagadougou. Langella had spent 40 years in military service, rising through the ranks that had taken him from the jungles of Central Africa to the mountains of Afghanistan. He had given orders that moved armies and toppled governments, always convinced that strength meant the capacity to impose one's will through force. But watching TRAORÉ walk freely among his people, seeing the joy on faces that had every reason to harbor hatred for foreign interference, Lenglet felt something he had rarely experienced in his decorated career: shame. The letter he finally wrote was simple, devoid of military jargon or diplomatic hedging. Once I thought strength meant fear. Now I see strength is when a man walks out of chains and forgives the ones who bound him. I have spent a career measuring power in deployments and budgets when I should have measured it in hope restored and dignity upheld. The world has much to learn from leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, and soldiers like me have much to atone for. He signed it with his full name and rank, sealed it in a plain envelope, and sent it through diplomatic channels to Ouagadougou. He expected no reply, wanted no fanfare. The act of writing it was penance enough.
The letter arrived 3 days later, delivered to the presidential palace by a confused diplomatic courier who couldn't understand why a retired NATO general was corresponding directly with the African leader. It was read aloud to Traoré by an aide, who expected to be told to file it with the dozens of other messages arriving daily. Instead, Traoré asked for the letter to be framed and hung in a classroom at the Technical University, beside photographs of the water purification project and the solar panel installation. Not as a trophy of victory over a humbled enemy, but as a reminder that even the hardest hearts could soften when confronted with truth. The story of Traoré's capture and liberation spread far beyond Africa, carrying implications that intelligence analysts and political scientists would debate for years. In universities from Harvard to Oxford to the Sorbonne, professors restructured their courses on international relations to account for this new model of soft power. The mercenaries themselves became an inadvertent case study in the psychology of moral awakening. Marco Delvaux, the Belgian soldier who had freed Traoré, found himself at the center of media attention he neither wanted nor felt he deserved. When reporters asked him why he had chosen to act against orders, his answer was simple: "Because I saw what courage looks like, and I wanted to be on its side." Several of his fellow mercenaries followed his lead, abandoning military contracting to work for humanitarian organizations across Africa. They carried with them hard-earned wisdom about the difference between power and strength, between following orders and following conscience. The diplomatic fallout proved less severe than European officials had feared, largely because Traoré himself declined to make it an international incident. In his only formal statement about the affair, delivered to the Pan-African Union Assembly in Kigali, he said simply, "Mistakes become opportunities when we learn from them. I hope the world has learned something from what happened in the desert." But the real impact was felt at the grassroots level, in villages and schools and community centers across Africa, where young people saw proof that their leaders could not be broken by foreign powers, that their dignity could not be purchased by foreign money. 6 months later, the invitation came to Aminata Kone in an envelope bearing the seal of the Pan-African Youth Assembly. The 16-year-old girl who had first shared Traoré's photograph on social media was being asked to address the continent's future leaders in Kigali. The journey from her village to the assembly hall was more than geographic. She carried with her the Burkina Faso flag her grandmother had sewn by lamplight, its colors still bright, despite the desert sand that had settled into its fibers during that day of witness. When she took the stage before an audience of presidents, ministers, entrepreneurs, and activists from across Africa, she carried no notes, no prepared remarks. She simply told the truth as she had seen it. "I saw him walk, not to hurt, not to punish, but to return.
He returned to build, not to destroy, to give, not to take, to remind us all what it means to lead. Her words, broadcast live across the continent, became a rallying cry for a generation of young Africans who had grown up watching their leaders dismiss foreign interference as inevitable. They saw in Traoré's quiet strength a model for what leadership could be when it drew power from service rather than domination. The standing ovation that followed lasted 7 minutes, but its echo would reverberate for years in classrooms and community centers where her speech was replayed, studied, and internalized by young people learning to see themselves as the authors of their continent's future, rather than subjects of someone else's story. In the eastern village of Sangha, where drought had withered crops and neglect had crumbled infrastructure, an unexpected volunteer arrived with tools instead of weapons. Marcus Delvaux, the former mercenary who had chosen conscience over orders, led a reconstruction team funded by the very European organizations that had once employed him for darker purposes. He worked with a methodical precision of a man seeking redemption through concrete accomplishments. Houses rose from ruins, wells brought clean water to families who had walked miles to fill their containers. Solar panels powered schools that had operated by candlelight for years. When reporters found him mixing concrete alongside local workers under the merciless Saharan sun, they expected to find a man consumed by guilt. Instead, they discovered someone who had found peace in the rhythm of construction, in the daily evidence that destruction could be reversed by patient effort. "Why here?" a journalist asked, watching him install a water pump that would serve 300 families. Delvaux paused, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Because I once carried fire without knowing its weight, now I choose to carry light." The metaphor was lost on the reporter, but perfectly clear to the village elder who had watched foreign soldiers come and go for 50 years. This one had returned not to take, but to give, not to dominate, but to serve. The transformation of Sangha became a model replicated across the Sahel, as former mercenaries and aid workers collaborated on projects that addressed root causes rather than symptoms. It was development work stripped of colonial paternalism, built on respect rather than pity. 1 year after his capture, Traoré returned alone to the desert where it had all begun. No convoy, no security detail, no media coverage. Just a man walking back to a place that had tested him and found him unbreakable.
Conclusions? He asked his foreign minister, Wang Yi. The Americans and Europeans fundamentally misunderstood what they were dealing with, Wang replied. They saw Africa through colonial frameworks, resource extraction, client states, proxy conflicts. They missed the emergence of genuine indigenous leadership. And we? We've been building relationships based on mutual benefit rather than dominance. Our Belt and Road infrastructure projects in Africa are positioned perfectly to benefit from this new political reality. She nodded, turning to a detailed map of Africa marked with red dots indicating Chinese investments, ports, railways, telecommunications networks, mining operations. Unlike European colonial infrastructure designed to extract resources to the metropolis, Chinese projects were designed to connect African nations to each other and to global markets. "What does Traoré want?" she asked. "Based on our analysis, dignity, respect, the ability to develop his country without foreign interference, technology transfer rather than aid dependency." "All things we can provide." "Yes, sir. But more than that, he represents a model of leadership that could spread across the continent. Strong, principled, technologically savvy, committed to genuine development rather than corruption." She stood and walked to a photograph hanging on his office wall.
a picture of himself as a young man working in rural China during the Cultural Revolution. The experience had taught him that real power came from understanding what people needed and finding ways to provide it. "Schedule a state visit," he ordered. "But not here. I'll go to Ouagadougou. It's time the world saw where China's priorities lie." The announcement, made simultaneously in Beijing and Ouagadougou 2 days later, sent shockwaves through Western capitals. A Chinese president visiting Burkina Faso was unprecedented. Small African nations traditionally received lower-level delegations, not the full pageantry of a state visit. But Xi understood what his Western counterparts were missing. The future of global influence would be built not by dominating the strong, but by respectfully engaging the overlooked. In the Oval Office, President Joe Biden stared at intelligence briefings that painted an increasingly uncomfortable picture of American influence in Africa. The TRAORÉ incident had exposed the limitations of a foreign policy still rooted in Cold War assumptions about spheres of influence and proxy relationships. "Tell me again," Biden said to Secretary of State Antony Blinken, "how we ended up on the wrong side of this story." Blinken shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We weren't directly involved, Mr. President. The mercenaries were European contractors." "That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking how we created a situation where a legitimate African leader gets kidnapped and our first instinct is to worry about stability rather than justice." The room fell silent. Around the table sat the architects of American foreign policy, seasoned diplomats and intelligence officials who had spent decades managing global crises. But the TRAORÉ incident had revealed something uncomfortable about their approach. They had been so focused on managing Africa that they had forgotten to listen to it. "The Russians are positioning themselves as the principled alternative to Western interference," reported CIA Director William Burns, "and the Chinese are offering concrete development partnerships while we're still debating aid packages." "What does TRAORÉ want from us?" Biden asked. "Respect," replied Susan Rice, the domestic policy advisor who had previously served as UN ambassador. "He wants to be treated as an equal partner rather than a client state leader." Biden leaned back in his chair, remembering his own decades in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he had watched American foreign policy swing between engagement and neglect, intervention and isolation, always seeming to miss the middle ground of genuine partnership. "Set up a meeting," he decided. "Not here. I'll go to him. And I want to bring something concrete: debt relief, technology transfer, educational exchanges, real partnership, not just photo opportunities." The decision to visit Burkina Faso marked a significant shift in American Africa policy. Previous presidents had made grand tours of safe, stable African allies. Biden would be the first to visit a country specifically because of its leader's confrontation with Western power. 1 year after the desert incident, African leaders gathered in Addis Ababa for an extraordinary session of the African Union. The agenda was officially titled "Advancing African Integration in the 21st Century," but everyone understood the real purpose: to consolidate the lessons learned from TRAORÉ's experience into a coherent continental strategy. The assembly hall buzzed with conversations in dozens of languages as presidents, prime ministers, and foreign ministers debated the implications of what had happened. Some worried about antagonizing traditional Western partners, others argued for more aggressive assertion of African sovereignty.
The abandoned camp was barely visible now, its temporary structures scattered by wind and claimed by sand. Only careful observation revealed where the cage had stood, where the mercenaries had wrestled with their consciences, where hundreds of citizens had gathered to witness their leader's liberation. He knelt in the sand and let it run through his fingers, each grain carrying memories of storm and stillness, captivity and freedom, fear and courage. The desert had been his classroom,
teaching lessons about power that no political science textbook could convey. As the sun reached its zenith, he placed a single stone on the spot where his cage had stood, not a monument to his suffering, but a marker of transformation. Future travelers would pass this anonymous rock without knowing its significance, but for him, it represented the moment when chains became choices, when captivity became catalyst. The wind picked up, swirling sand around his feet and tugging at the red beret that had become a symbol of African independence. He adjusted it with the unconscious gesture of a man comfortable with the weight of leadership, then began the walk back to his vehicle. Behind him, the stone waited in the sand, marking a spot where the old order had tried to reassert itself and failed. The desert would remember what had happened here long after the last human witness was gone. It would remember that power built on truth is stronger than power built on force, that a leader's greatest weapon is the willingness to be vulnerable in service of something greater than himself. As his footsteps faded into the distance, the endless dunes stretched toward horizons that promised new challenges and new opportunities. The lion had walked free, and the world would never be quite the same. 3 weeks after the desert incident, in a secure conference room deep within the Kremlin, President Vladimir Putin studied satellite imagery with the focused attention of a chess master analyzing his opponent's strategy. The images showed the abandoned mercenary camp, the civilian gathering, and most importantly, the moment when Ibrahim Traoré stepped free from his cage. "Explain to me," Putin said to his intelligence chief, Sergei Naryshkin, "how a regional African leader managed to orchestrate what amounts to a masterpiece of psychological warfare without firing a single shot." Naryshkin shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sir, our analysis suggests it wasn't orchestrated in the traditional sense. The response appeared organic. Grassroots mobilization, enabled by technology we helped provide but didn't control." "The satellite?" "The African Pantech satellite, yes. Launched using our Soyuz system 6 months ago, but the operational control was transferred entirely to African technicians. We provided the launch capability, they provided the vision." Putin smiled. Not the cold smile his enemies feared, but something warmer, tinged with genuine admiration. "So, while the Americans and Europeans were playing 19th-century power games, the Africans were building 21st-century solutions." "It appears so, sir." "And Traoré?" "He's everything our intelligence suggested and more. Educated in Moscow, trained in engineering, speaks 6 languages fluently. But more than that, he understands power in ways that surprised even us." Putin stood and walked to the window overlooking Red Square, where tourists photographed monuments to Russian power built in stone and steel. But the real power of the 21st century, he was beginning to understand, might be built from different materials entirely. "Set up a secure channel," he ordered. "I want to speak with him directly." The conversation that took place 72 hours later, encrypted and routed through 7 relay stations across 3 continents, lasted only 12 minutes, but it established parameters for a relationship that would reshape global politics for the next decade. "Mr. President," Putin began, speaking in French, they both preferred for international diplomacy, "you have demonstrated something remarkable." "I demonstrated nothing," Traoré replied calmly. "I simply trusted my people to be who they have always been." "And who is that?" "Free." The word hung between them across thousands of miles of fiber-optic cable, carrying implications that both men understood perfectly. This was not the freedom of Western democracy, with its emphasis on individual rights and market capitalism. This was something older and deeper, the freedom of a people to determine their own destiny without external interference. I believe that Russia and Africa have more in common than either of us has with the West. We have one thing in common, Traoré agreed. We both remember what it feels like to be underestimated.
Traoré himself sat quietly in the Burkina Faso delegation, wearing a simple dark suit rather than traditional robes or military uniform. He had been invited to address the assembly, but his presence alone carried more weight than any speech he might give. President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, serving as AU chairman, called for order. We gather today to discuss not just what happened to our brother Ibrahim, but what his experience teaches us about our collective future. The first speaker was President Félix Tshisekedi of the Democratic Republic of Congo, whose country's vast mineral wealth had made it a target of foreign interference for over a century. What we witnessed in the Sahara, Tshisekedi said, was not just the liberation of one man, but the awakening of continental consciousness. For too long we have allowed others to define our stories, manage our conflicts, and determine our priorities. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the hall. The sentiment was shared across political divides, from leftist revolutionaries to market-oriented pragmatists. African leaders were tired of being treated as junior partners in decisions affecting their own continent. President Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya stood to respond. But we must be careful not to let justified pride become destructive isolation. Africa needs global partnerships to develop our economies and improve our people's lives. The debate that followed lasted 3 days and touched on everything from trade policy to security cooperation to diplomatic representation. But at its heart was a fundamental question. How could Africa engage with the world as an equal partner, rather than a supplicant or victim? When Traoré finally took the podium on the third day, the hall fell completely silent. His words, when they came, were measured and deliberate. Brothers and sisters, we stand at a crossroads. We can continue to react to others' initiatives, or we can begin setting our own agenda. The choice is not between isolation and dependence. It is between dignity and submission. He paused, looking out at faces that represented nearly 1.4 billion people across 54 nations. In the desert, I learned that true strength comes not from what we can destroy, but from what we choose to build. Let us build an Africa worthy of our children's dreams. The standing ovation that followed lasted 8 minutes, but its impact would endure for years as the foundation of what historians would later call the African Renaissance. Dr. Aminata Traoré, no relation to the president despite sharing his surname, stood before a classroom of young engineers at the University of Sciences and Technology in Ouagadougou, pointing to equations that represented more than mathematical relationships. They represented African technological independence. The water purification system you see here, she explained to her rapt students, processes 10,000 liters per hour using only solar power and locally manufactured components. No foreign patents, no imported filters, no dependency on external supply chains. The prototype hummed quietly in the corner of the laboratory, its sleek design belying the revolutionary nature of its engineering. Developed entirely by African researchers using materials available across the continent, it represented a fundamental shift from aid-dependent development to indigenous innovation. "But Professor," asked Kwame, a brilliant student from Ghana, "why reinvent technology that already exists? Wouldn't it be more efficient to import proven systems?" Dr. Traoré smiled, recognizing the question that had shaped her own journey from MIT-trained engineer to advocate for African technological sovereignty. Because, Kwame, efficiency is not just about speed or cost. True efficiency includes sustainability,
adaptability, and dignity. When you depend on others for your basic needs, you surrender control over your future. She walked to a wall covered with photographs documenting the evolution of African technology, from ancient irrigation systems in Sudan to modern solar installations in Morocco, from traditional medicine in Madagascar to cutting-edge telecommunications in Rwanda. Our ancestors were innovators. They developed mathematics, medicine, architecture, and engineering thousands of years before Europeans claimed to discover such knowledge. We are not trying to catch up with the world. We are reclaiming our place as contributors to human knowledge. The students leaned forward, energized by a vision of themselves not as recipients of foreign technology, but as creators of African solutions to global challenges. Over the following months, similar laboratories sprouted across the continent, funded by a combination of government investment and private donations from the African diaspora. Young engineers developed drought-resistant crops using traditional breeding methods accelerated by genetic analysis. Computer scientists created software platforms designed for African languages and business practices. Medical researchers investigated traditional treatments using modern analytical tools. The movement gained international attention when African-developed technologies began outperforming foreign alternatives in real-world conditions. A solar panel design optimized for Saharan conditions proved more efficient than German imports. A mobile banking system developed in Kenya became the global standard for financial inclusion. A medical diagnostic tool created in Ghana provided more accurate results than expensive European equipment.
In a rural village 200 kilometers from Ouagadougou, 8-year-old Fatima Ouedraogo raised her hand to ask a question that would reshape African education policy. "Teacher," she said in perfect French, "why do our textbooks show pictures of snow when we have never seen snow? Why do they talk about wheat when we grow millet?" Her teacher, Marie Kabore, paused in the middle of a lesson about European geography, a subject mandated by a curriculum inherited from French colonial administration and never meaningfully updated for African realities. The question sparked a conversation that lasted the rest of the school day and continued in homes throughout the village that evening. Parents who had struggled through school systems that taught them more about Paris than Ouagadougou began demanding education that prepared their children for African realities rather than European fantasies. Within 6 months, the village had become a pilot site for what education ministers called the African Curriculum Initiative, a comprehensive redesign of primary and secondary education to center African history, geography, languages, and problem-solving approaches while maintaining international standards in mathematics, science, and technology. Students began learning African languages alongside French and English. History classes explored the great kingdoms of Mali, Songhai, and Ethiopia before touching on European colonization. Geography lessons focused on African rivers, mountains, and climate patterns. Literature classes featured Chinua Achebe and Wole Soyinka alongside Voltaire and Victor Hugo. But the most radical change was in pedagogy itself. Instead of rote memorization and rigid discipline inherited from French educational models, teachers began incorporating African traditions of communal learning, oral storytelling, and practical problem-solving. The results were immediate and dramatic. Student scores improved, but more importantly, students showed greater engagement with their studies and stronger identification with their cultural heritage. Dropout rates declined as education became relevant to students' lived experiences. International education experts initially dismissed the reforms as lowering standards or cultural nationalism.
But when African students began outperforming their peers in international competitions, particularly in mathematics, science, and creative problem-solving, the criticism turned to curiosity. Delegation after delegation visited Burkina Faso to study what became known as the Ouagadougou model. They found students who were not just academically successful, but culturally confident, globally aware, and deeply committed to contributing to their community's development. In the gleaming towers of Ghana's financial district, Kofi Asante studied commodity trading charts that told the story of Africa's economic revolution. 5 years after the TRAORÉ incident, African nations had fundamentally restructured their relationship with global markets. Gone were the days when African countries exported raw materials to be processed abroad and then imported finished goods at premium prices. The new model emphasized value-added processing, regional integration, and South-South trade partnerships. "Show me the cocoa numbers," Asante requested of his analytical team. The charts that appeared on the conference room screens documented a transformation that economists thought was impossible. Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, and other West African nations had invested heavily in chocolate processing facilities, capturing value that had previously flowed to European and American companies. Similar patterns emerged across the continent. Zambian copper was now refined in Lusaka rather than London. Ethiopian coffee was roasted and packaged in Addis Ababa rather than Seattle. Botswana diamonds were cut and polished in Gaborone rather than Amsterdam. The shift required massive investments in infrastructure, technology, and human capital, investments that traditional aid models had never prioritized. But African governments, working through the newly strengthened African Development Bank and partnerships with China, India, and Brazil, had found ways to finance transformation without surrendering sovereignty. "The Europeans are nervous," reported Asante's deputy, pointing to intelligence about declining European imports of African raw materials. "They're losing their traditional advantage." Asante nodded, remembering his own education at the London School of Economics, where he had been taught that Africa's role in the global economy was to provide raw materials for more sophisticated economies to process. The professors had presented this as natural comparative advantage rather than structural exploitation. "Let them be nervous," he replied. "Competition is good for everyone." The economic transformation was not without challenges. Some African countries struggled with corruption, infrastructure deficits, and political instability that hindered development efforts. But the overall trend was undeniable. Africa was becoming a producer and exporter of finished goods rather than just raw materials. International investors took notice. Instead of extractive industries focused on resource exploitation, foreign investment began flowing toward manufacturing, technology, and services sectors that created value within African economies. The psychological impact was as important as the economic one. Young Africans began to see their continent not as a source of charity cases, but as a land of opportunity. Diaspora populations started returning home to participate in the transformation, bringing skills and capital acquired abroad. In the studios of Nollywood, and the emerging film industries of Senegal, Morocco, and Kenya, a new generation of African filmmakers was telling stories that had never been heard on global screens. But unlike previous waves of African cinema that focused primarily on poverty, conflict, and victimization, these films celebrated African achievement, complexity, and vision. Amina Hassan, a Sudanese-British director whose latest film had just premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, represented this new wave of African storytelling. Her film, The Desert Speaks, was a fictionalized account of the TRAORÉ incident that explored themes of dignity, resistance, and transformation. For too long, Hassan explained in an interview with the BBC, African stories have been told through foreign lenses that emphasize what we lack rather than what we possess. We are reclaiming our narrative. The film industry transformation was part of a broader cultural renaissance sweeping the continent. African musicians were topping global charts not by imitating Western styles, but by modernizing traditional African sounds. Fashion designers were creating internationally acclaimed collections based on African textiles and patterns. Authors were writing novels that explored African experiences without explaining them to foreign audiences. The movement had economic as well as cultural impact. Nigeria's entertainment industry, already the world's second largest by volume of production, began expanding into other African markets and beyond. South African musicians found audiences from Brazil to Indonesia. Ethiopian fashion designers opened boutiques in New York and Paris. But the most significant change was psychological. Young Africans were growing up with positive representations of themselves and their cultures in media, fashion, and arts. They saw African characters as heroes, African settings as desirable, African values as worthy of global respect. UNESCO studies documented declining rates of cultural alienation among African youth who increasingly identified with African rather than European or American cultural models. This shift correlated with improved academic performance, reduced emigration pressure, and stronger civic engagement. Ambassador Aisha Laraba Abdullahi stood before the UN Security Council, representing not just Niger, but the collective voice of African nations demanding structural reforms to global governance. The speech she was about to deliver had been crafted through months of consultation among African foreign ministers, representing a coordinated challenge to international institutions that had excluded African perspectives for decades. "Mr. President, distinguished delegates," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 20 years navigating international diplomacy while never forgetting her roots in rural Niger. For 78 years, this council has made decisions affecting African lives without adequate African representation. We have watched permanent members debate African conflicts as if we were passive objects rather than sovereign actors. Today, we demand change. The proposal that followed was radical in its simplicity. Expansion of the Security Council to include permanent African representation. Reform of international financial institutions to reflect current global economic realities, and restructuring of aid relationships to emphasize partnership rather than dependence. European and American diplomats shifted uncomfortably. For decades, they had managed African affairs through bilateral relationships with individual countries, preventing coordinated African positions on global issues. But the TRAORÉ incident had catalyzed African unity in ways that decades of political rhetoric had failed to achieve. Some will argue that Africa lacks the economic or military power to demand such changes. But as recent events have demonstrated, power in the 21st century is not measured only in military budgets or economic statistics. It is measured in moral authority, demographic weight, and the ability to inspire. Behind the diplomatic language lay an implicit threat. African nations could withdraw from international institutions that failed to represent their interests. With 54 UN member states, Africa commanded significant voting power when unified. The speech sparked months of negotiations that ultimately resulted in the most significant reforms to international institutions since the end of World War II. Africa gained permanent representation on the Security Council, increased voting power in the World Bank and IMF, and new mechanisms for collective bargaining on trade and development issues. 10 years after the desert incident, Aminata Kone stood before another assembly, this time as the elected Secretary General of the African Union, the youngest person ever to hold the position at age 26. The girl who had first shared Traoré's photograph on social media had become the voice of African continental integration. Her inauguration speech, delivered in Addis Ababa before an audience that included presidents, prime ministers, and millions watching across the continent, articulated a vision that her generation took for granted but had seemed impossible just a decade earlier. We are the generation that grew up watching an African president walk free from captivity through the power of continental solidarity. We are the generation that saw dignity triumph over force, unity overcome division, and truth defeat manipulation. The policies she outlined reflected lessons learned from the Traoré experience. Continental infrastructure projects linking African nations to each other rather than just to former colonial powers. A pan-African currency reducing dependence on dollar and euro transactions. Educational exchanges that sent African students to universities across the continent rather than just to European and American institutions. But her most radical proposal was the establishment of an African Peace Corps, young Africans spending 2 years working on development projects in countries other than their own, building the personal relationships that would underpin continental integration. My generation does not see artificial borders drawn by colonizers as permanent features of our landscape, she declared. We see a continent united by shared values, common challenges, and collective aspirations. The audience rose in sustained applause, but the real measure of her speech's impact came in the weeks that followed, as African governments began implementing policies that had been merely aspirational just years earlier. In a small museum in the Sahara, where the mercenary camp once stood, visitors study exhibits that tell the story of what historians call the day that changed Africa. The displays include photographs of the original incident, testimonies from participants, and artifacts donated by those who were there. A simple stone marks the spot where Ibrahim Traoré's cage stood. Nearby, a plaque bears the words that Aminata Kone spoke to the Pan-African Youth Assembly. "I saw him walk, not to hurt, not to punish, but to return. He returned to build. He did not return to destroy." But the museum's most popular exhibit is an interactive display that allows visitors to trace the ripple effects of those 48 hours in the desert. They can follow the diplomatic cables that reshaped international relations, the technological innovations that emerged from African laboratories, the cultural productions that redefined African identity, and the educational reforms that prepared new generations for leadership. School groups come regularly, and teachers use the museum to explain how individual acts of courage can catalyze historic transformation. They emphasize that Traoré's importance lay not in his suffering, but in his response to it, choosing dignity over vengeance, building over destruction, trust over suspicion. Outside the museum, the desert stretches toward horizons that hold different promises than they did 20 years earlier. Solar panels glint from installations that power cities hundreds of miles away. High-speed rail lines connect nations that were once isolated from each other. Satellite dishes beam African-produced content to global audiences hungry for stories that celebrate human dignity and possibility. The lion walked free, and his footprints became highways that carried an entire continent toward a future it chose for itself. The desert remembers and teaches its lessons to all who have ears to hear, that cages are built by fear, but fear dissolves when truth walks free, when people choose courage over convenience, and when leaders understand that real power lies not in the capacity to destroy, but in the commitment to build something worthy of humanity's highest aspirations. In classrooms across Africa and beyond, children learn that history is not something that happens to them, but something they participate in creating. They learn that a single moment of moral clarity can reshape the world, that individual courage can catalyze collective transformation, and that the arc of history bends toward justice only when people have the courage to bend it. The story continues, written daily by ordinary people making extraordinary choices, carried forward by young voices that refuse to accept limitations imposed by others, guided by the simple truth that human dignity is not negotiable, and freedom is not a gift to be granted, but a birthright to be claimed. The desert speaks, and the world listens.